Welcome to the podcast for Westside, a Jesus Church. We hope this teaching encourages and empowers you to love, learn, and live the way of Jesus.
When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, and they got into a boat, and they set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Let me hear you say, "Do not be afraid." And they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. And some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. And once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and they went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. Of all the stories in the Gospel of John, the story that we just read is, I think, by far the most legendary. I mean, you think about how many songs and sermons and works of art have been influenced by the story of Jesus walking on the water and calming the stormy sea and calming the storm that was in the hearts of the disciples. This last week I was doing some research. If you're into art history, you might like this, but I was stunned by how many dozens of paintings throughout history, many of which are hundreds of years old, have been inspired just from this story. Here's one example. The Russian artist Ivan Ivyazovsky. And he painted this in the 1800s. And if you're familiar with that period in history, this painting portrays the dialectics of Romanticism. Notice how you have turbulence and darkness on one side, but then you have peace and the presence of Jesus on the other. And Ivan, he painted this not just because he was inspired by what John said about Jesus, but he painted this to bring hope to Russia at that time. While he was still alive, he was one of the most popular painters in Russia, and to this day, he remains a very popular painter. But he wanted to comfort the Russians who were traumatized by the social and political upheaval of the 1800s. And so every line, every brushstroke in this painting was meant to convey something. So you have the boat, which he saw as a metaphor of a nation that was sailing through stormy waters on the brink of revolution. But then, of course, Jesus coming, walking towards them to rescue the nation and to bring them from a place of chaos to peace and unity. Now, whether it's this painting or countless others or works of art in the poetry and literature as well, that there's something about the sea that has always been this symbol of chaos or hardship or difficulty. And think about all the stories that we're familiar with that have this idea of the sea being, in some sense, a place of hardship, whether it's the Odyssey by Homer, or Treasure Island, or Master and Commander, Titanic, Moby Dick, Finding Nemo, these great works of literary genius. But one thing they have in common is this idea of man versus the sea, right? Hope versus despair, peace versus chaos. And I point that out to you because that way of understanding the sea as a metaphor, as an archetype of chaos, it was definitely the case for the disciples in our text this morning, because in Jewish culture, they perceived the sea as a dark, foreboding, and threatening place. Now, when we hear ocean, we think vacation, or Cannon Beach, or saltwater taffy, right? We have all kinds of happy feels towards the sea. But in Jewish culture, that's not how they saw it. In Genesis, we have God dividing the land from the sea, chaos from order. In the book of Exodus, the one thing that kept the children of Israel from freedom as they saw it was a sea, the Red Sea, and then God parted it and they passed through. Or in Psalm 46, the author, he describes the sea as a place of raging and foaming and chaos and despair. When we understand how they interpreted and how they saw the ocean, it helps us understand, I think, a little bit about what's going on here. Because they're in a situation where they were absolutely terrified. In fact, if you want to look back down in verse 19, it says they were frightened in the NIV. And I think that's a massive understatement. In the Greek language, the word is way stronger. The word for frightened in the Greek is phobeo. And it's where we get our English word for phobia. In other words, we could translate it as terrified or even shaking with fear. Have you ever been in a situation, have you ever been in a season in your life where you've actually been shaking with fear? My family and I, we have a dog. Her name is Bella. She's a golden doodle. She's amazing, beautiful dog, super sharp, super intelligent. But like most pets, she has one or two quirks, one of which, when she was younger, she just had this fascination with eating socks. She's always eating socks. But another interesting thing about Bella is she has a phobia, and I cannot understand it. My wife and I have been trying to figure this out because she's absolutely terrified of Amazon boxes, like a true phobia. And it doesn't matter how big the Amazon box is. We hear the mail come, we open the door, there's the box. It could be this big, could be this big. It could even be an envelope. This happened yesterday. I brought in an Amazon envelope. The moment she sees the Amazon box, she runs in fear. It's like super sad, and we're so confused. We've had her since a puppy. We have no idea why she's so afraid of Amazon boxes. Maybe it's because Amazon's taking over the world, and Alexa listens to all our conversations, and she's like, no to globalism. I don't know what's happening here. I'm sure that's it. But it's a phobia. It's something it's something she can't understand fully. And here's the disciples. They're encountering this phobia. It was a cultural phobia. It was a metaphor of chaos. They're in a situation where they're shaking with fear. Here's the question that I want to unpack with you in the short time that we have today. Why would Jesus, knowing that the sea was an archetype of chaos, why would Jesus, knowing that this is the one thing that they were absolutely terrified of, why would Jesus let them go through this storm? In fact, when you go to Mark's gospel, it seems to imply that Jesus intentionally sends them into the storm. He knew what was happening. He knew what they were about to face, and yet he sends them into the storm anyway. And the question that's lurking behind that question, one that we all wrestle with, it's the question of all questions, I think, and it's this: why would God allow us, his disciples, to go through times of chaos and fear and vulnerability? Why the storm? That's the question that's before us today. Why the storm? And so as I've been thinking through this passage, I notice in this passage a few thoughts, a few ideas, a few potential reasons why Jesus would allow it. If you're taking notes, you may want to jot this first thought down. I think Jesus let them go through the storm, number one, to grow their faith, How so? Well, keep in mind, this story comes after what? We saw it last week. Jesus and his disciples are on the mountain, and they're hungry. There's, in fact, thousands of hungry people. And Jesus says, what are we going to do about all these hungry people? And they're like, I don't know. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough food trucks. What's going to happen? But here's a young lad with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus does what? He takes the loaves, he takes the fishes, he blesses them, he breaks them, and with them, everyone was full. And not only were they full, how many baskets were left over? Do you remember? Yeah, 12 baskets. I think one for each disciple. Each disciple had a take-home box as a reminder, Jesus can do all things. Now, when you look at that story, at its heart, at its core, it's a story of generous abundance, right? Blessing, favor, and if I'm honest, I love stories like that. I love teaching stories like that. I like it, and I think we'd all agree, when we go through seasons of blessing, whether it's financial blessing or a relationship or things are going well at work or physical health. We like it when God goes above and beyond our expectation. But here's the problem, is that faith that is dependent on blessing for its growth often lacks growth. Faith that is dependent on favor often lacks depth. Rutgers University, they did a study on this a few years ago about trees, and what they discovered is that trees in times of rain, the roots remain relatively shallow, but when it's a time of drought, the roots of that tree go deeper and deeper in search of nutrients. And I think so too. Our soul, like the roots of a tree, are most deepened, not necessarily in the times of favor and blessing and abundance when everything is working out how you hope, but our soul is deepened in those times of lack and storms and troubles and trials and hardship and drama and difficulty. Why? Because it's then that we're forced into a deeper faith and dependence upon God. I think more important to God than Him getting rid of the storm is Him teaching us to meet the storm and walk through the storm, not just get around the storm. How many of you who show fans have read the book The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom? Okay, quite a few of you have. If you haven't read that book, repent. And get a hold of it. Honestly, it is so good. My daughter just read it recently. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's hard, too, because it tells the story of this godly woman, Corrie ten Boom, who went through unthinkable trials. She opened up her home during World War II for Jewish people to find refuge and safety, hence the name, The Hiding Place. But then later on, she was arrested. She was taken to a concentration camp. Everything was taken from her. But what's so redemptive and beautiful about her story is that even though she lost everything, she still held on to her faith. In fact, as you read it, you discover her faith grew through that experience. And then she said this, and for me, I think these are some of the most beautiful words ever spoken, and very convicting, but full of depth. She said, "You may never know that Jesus is all that you need until Jesus is all that you have." What if that's what's going on here in this story? It's easy to believe in Jesus when we're on the mountain. It's easy to believe in Jesus when there's an abundance of loaves and fishes. Sure, I can follow a Messiah like that when there's money and resources and the girl says yes to the date and everything's working out. Sure, yeah, sign me up. I'll be your disciple. But what about when all of those things are stripped away? What about those seasons when it doesn't work out the way you hoped? Will you believe then? A faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. It's kind of like a tea bag. You don't know the flavor of the tea bag till it's put in hot water. And I think there are times when God puts us into hot water because He wants to draw faith out of us that we didn't even know we had. And I also think, hear me out here, this point is important, but it could be taken the wrong way. I also think there are times God allows us to be in the hot water because there are issues in us that He wants to bring to the surface. There's stuff in us that's not healthy, unhealthy patterns and ways of thinking and addictions or even sin. And I say hear me out here because some people would take this theology in a destructive way and they would argue that every time you suffer, it's because there's sin in your life. And I don't believe that's the case at all. But I do believe there are times God allows a storm because there are things He's wanting to draw out of us. He's wanting us to get back on track. It says when they went through the storm in the passage we just read, suddenly they're there on the other side. Sometimes it's the storm that gets us to the other side. Sometimes it's the force of the wind that moves us quicker than we never thought possible. It deepens us. I met with a guy just recently. He's sharing with me his story. I hear so many crazy, heartbreaking stories. This guy got in a construction accident, fell off a roof, and literally broke his back. He's in the hospital, and he's telling me what it was like medically, what he's going through emotionally. And he's there for months in rehab, and they're trying to put him back together. And I was asking, what was that like for your relationship with God? And he looked at me and said, "Dominic, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." I'm like, "You're kidding." He said, "No." He said, "As I'm on my back, it kind of literally forced me to look up." He said, "At that point in my life, I was doing things I shouldn't have been involved in. I was making some decisions that were really unhealthy and destructive. There was stuff in my marriage and my relationship with my wife that it was just heartbreaking. And he said, I was going down this path of destruction, and it was leading to all kinds of stuff. And he said, I think God allowed this accident to happen because he knew that the only time that I would listen to him would be in that hospital bed. And for some of us, the storm is that purifying season where God is bringing to the surface those issues, those sins, those habits. And God is saying, I want to meet you there, and I want to cleanse you from that. I want to make you more into my image. This is why in the book of 1 Peter, this is worth writing down if you're taking notes. In 1 Peter 1, verse 5, it says, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Notice, these have come why? So the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Why the storm? I think, first of all, it's to grow our faith. But there's another point here. Let's take it deeper. I think Jesus allowed the storm, number 2, if you're taking notes, to strengthen their hope. Do you realize that this wasn't the only storm that the disciples went through? In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus actually warned them. We'll get to John 16 in about 12 years. It'll be amazing. But in John 16, verse 33, Jesus gathers his disciples together and he says, hey, in this world, you will have what? Trouble. But take heart, for I have overcome the world. The word for trouble that Jesus uses is a fascinating word. In the Greek language, it's the word thlipsis. Let me hear you say thlipsis. Thlipsis was a form of Roman torture. You know, the more I study about the Romans, the more I realize they really like to torture people. Jack Bauer would have fit in really well in that culture. They're all about it. And thlipsis was one of the ways that they hurt people. If you were a prisoner, they wanted to punish you. They wanted to extract information from you. They would lay you on the ground. They would put a plank on your chest. They would take a heavy boulder. They would roll that boulder up on your chest, and it would crush you. The word thlipsis can be translated as crushing. Many times the rib cage would break and fracture. They would have a hard time breathing. This is the word that Jesus used when he gathered his disciples together. He said, you're going to face trial. Have you ever been through a season where it feels like a heavy weight on your chest? Have you ever gone through a time where you're gasping for air? Jesus told his disciples, he said, know this, a time is coming when you will go through a crushing as well. A couple years ago, we studied the book of Acts together as a church, and we saw that what Jesus warned about actually came to pass. The disciples were persecuted, they lost their homes, many relationships were fractured, they were chased, they were pursued, they were thrown in prison. Some of the disciples literally went through other shipwrecks. And I think what Jesus is doing here in John chapter 6 is actually to prepare them for that. Check this out, this is huge. Jesus, by allowing them to go through the storm, he is equipping them for what was to come. By allowing them to go through the storm here, he's giving them the tools and the resources that they would need later on to draw from when they were in a similar place. And more importantly, to give them hope that even as Jesus walked on the water here and calmed the storm here, they would have hope in their storm, in the persecution, in the trials that were ahead. They could remind themselves and others, hey, do you remember that time? Yeah, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Do you remember when we were at the Sea of Galilee and Jesus was with us and we went through this stormy sea and we were absolutely terrified because we hate the ocean. It's a horrible place. And the storm and the waves and the wind, we thought we were going to die. We didn't know if we'd make it through the night. Do you remember that time? Yeah, we remember that night. But do you remember too how Jesus came to us walking on the water? Yeah, I remember that. And do you remember how he got in the boat and with a word he calmed the storm? Do you remember that? And they could look back on this time and cling to it. It would strengthen their hope. And I think there are times, even now for some of you, where God allows us to go through the storm because it's actually preparing you and strengthening you for what's ahead. And it's a reminder to you for the years to come that the storm right now that is over your head is actually underneath his feet. Jesus walked on the waves that threatened to swallow up the boat. And that lesson is not just for you personally, it's also for the people in your life. Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He said, praise be to the God and Father. We just sang that. I love that song. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our trouble so that we could comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. This is huge. It's the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy says, I feel what you're going through. I'm so sorry you're there. Empathy says, I know what you're going through because I have been there too. Your story of pain can become someone else's source of hope. And I feel led to share that this morning because I know that some of you, you've gone through the storm. I know many of you, and I've heard many of your stories, and I know there's been cancer survivors, and people have gone through divorce, and people have wrestled with anxiety and depression, and you've gone through the storm. The lessons that you've learned in those seasons, and the depth that has resulted in your own soul as a byproduct of that, it's not just for you, it's for the people around you. Because all around you are people who are in a similar place. And what you've gone through can actually become tremendously liberating and life-giving for those that God has put in your life. That when we make the decision to open up and be authentic and vulnerable and say, yeah, I've been there and I've experienced that and I've gone through that pain and I know what the storm feels like, you'll discover redemption, not just for you, because I think there's tremendous healing when we begin to share our story, but you'll also find there's healing for those around you. People, even in this room, need to hear your story because it's going to give them the hope and comfort that they need, that Jesus will have the last word. There's this beautiful book by Henry Nouwen. It's called Being a Wounded Healer. And in it, he says this, that nobody escapes being wounded. We're all wounded people. Whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually, the main question is not, how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed? But, check this out, how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. Jesus, he is creating depth in his disciples that they would draw from for years, and he's also deepening their ministry so that they could help people who would go through storms. Number 3, and finally, and this is a point that I've been chewing on this last week. I never actually seen this story through this lens. So I hope you guys enjoy this, and I hope this part encourages you. I think number 3, it's not just to grow their faith and strengthen their hope, it's to deepen their love. If you have your Bibles open, look down in verse 19. So we saw the word frightened, phobia. But then Jesus said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." When Jesus said, "It is I," in the Greek language, it is ego ami. And it is literally translated as, I am. Now, does that ring a bell? I am that I am. That comes from where? Exodus chapter 3. Moses, he's in the desert. He had been there basically alone, hanging out with a bunch of sheep for 40 years. And then he sees a bush that's on fire and he hears a voice. For some of you, that's not surprising because when you burn bush, you hear voices too, but that's a whole nother conversation. Prayer room afterwards. Moses hears a voice. It was the voice of God. And God said, "Moses, I'm calling you to go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go." And Moses, like many of us, his response to that call was insecurity. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy enough. I can't talk. I'm a terrible communicator. He gives God all the lists of reasons why he couldn't do what God was calling him to do. But then God says, look, I made your mouth. I can pull this off. I am that I am. Who shall I say sent me? I am that I am. Who are you, God? I am that I am. And it's one of the most mysterious names for God. I am means I am holy, I am other, no beginning, no end. You can't define me, you can't explain me. I'm inexplainable, I'm uncontrollable, I'm unpredictable, I'm undeniable. It's what the German philosopher Rudolf Otto, he called numinous awe. That's who I am, Moses. And then he told Moses, do what? Take off your sandals, because the place where you stand is holy ground. Why? Because the only appropriate response to a God like that is worship. Now, track with me. This is what blew me away this last week. What happened when Jesus was brought into the boat? What happened when he calmed the storm? In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, it tells the same story. And Matthew says, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshiped, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. This is what blew me away. At the beginning of John chapter 6, when Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish, and all the people were fed, the response was what? Thank you. We're full. That was great. Yay, Jesus. We enjoyed that. But what you don't see in that story is the people worshiping. They were fed, they were happy, they were blessed, but they weren't worshiping. It wasn't until they went through a storm. It wasn't until they suffered. It wasn't until they grappled with phobeo, their fear. It wasn't until their back was against the wall. It wasn't until they wondered, are we going down, that they learned what it meant to worship. Have you found this to be so? That the people who have the greatest depth, the people who are the most passionate worshipers, the people who love God, are those who have gone through stuff. It's not necessarily those on the mountain who have it all. Blessing and favor and loaves and fishes and all kinds of money and all kinds of resources. And they're constantly in this place of blessing. What I've discovered, and I'm sure you have as well, is that those who have the greatest depth in their love for God are those who have been through the pain and the trials of storms. The cancer survivor. I just talked to a cancer survivor after 8 a.m. The single mom. The victim of injustice, racism, persecution, poverty. It seems to me that those are the people that have a story to tell. And that when they worship, you know it's real. Because they're not trying to get stuff from God. Give me more loaves. Give me more fishes. What I find with people like that, the Corrie ten Booms of the world, many of you who are in that space too, that when they worship, they're not trying to get stuff from God. They just want more of God. And just being with Him is what their heart desires. And could it be that that is the lesson that Jesus is teaching His disciples and us, bringing us to a place where it's less of a transactional give me, give me, give me. Jesus, just check all my boxes, consumeristic, flat, boring, stale Christianity, to a place of real depth and wonder and worship? Could it be that that is the reason for the storm? Those of you who are parents, you know what I'm talking about. Like when you first raise your kids, those first few years or whatever, it's very much a one-way thing, right? It's all about giving to your kid and providing for your kid. Here's a new jacket, and here's a new toy, and here's a new brother, here's a new sister, and right? You're always giving stuff to them, giving. But hopefully, as the relationship matures, you reach a point in that relationship where it's less transactional and one-sided, and what you find with your child is it's less about gimme. They just want to be with you. They just want to hang out with you. And as a parent, you're like, this is awesome, right? Now, that may not happen until they're 40. But hopefully, there does come a place where it's just about living in love. It's just about being with that person. And I think that Jesus brings us through seasons of life where we start out on the mountain and he rescues you and he saves you and you're baptized and you follow after him, or you see a miracle and there's loaves and fishes and all the happy feels and everything's wonderful. But then he leads you into a time of trial and lack and unanswered prayers and doubts and wounds and disappointments. But it's in that place that your faith comes alive. And it's that place that your love begins to mature, because the view is great on the mountain, but fruit grows in the valley. And what if God is leading us to that place where he's saying, I want you to learn what intimacy looks like, what relationship looks like, where you're content just to sit in my presence and be with me, not just try and get stuff from me. I think about when my daughter, Amelia, was 2 years old. At that time, we were living in Hawaii and went through this pretty traumatic health scare with her. And we're in the hospital, and she's having all these tests, and the diagnosis did not look good, and Lisa and I were just really worried. We didn't know what was going to happen. And our poor daughter, she just went through they're poking her constantly with these shots, and they're hooking up to all these machines. And I'll never forget walking into the hospital room, and she'd been awake for like 48 hours straight, and her poor eyes are just like glazed over, and her hair is sticking up. And she's like 2 years old. She doesn't know what's going on. It was scary. It was frightening, and she's exhausted, and she just came out of 2 hours of this long, long test. And I'll never forget walking into the room. And she looks up at me, and all she did was she put out her hands like this. And I knew what that meant. And I walk up to her, and I pick her up, and I give her a hug. And her arms, with all these wires everywhere, she wraps them around my neck. And she didn't ask for anything. She didn't complain. All she said was, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, was, Daddy, I love you. I think there are times in our life where Jesus allows the stuff, the storm, the heartache, the fear, the uncertainty, because he's wanting your heart once again to be filled with that childlike wonder. He's teaching you what it means to worship. He's showing you that faith isn't about certainty or simple bullet point answers. He's teaching you that faith is about closeness, love, faith, hope, taking off your sandals when you don't know how you're going to step into that next season, and you choose to worship anyway. Coming to a place like Corrie ten Boom, who said, you're all that I have, and you're all that I need. What if that is the reason why God is allowing you to be in the storm that you're in today? I close with this. Romans chapter 5 says, therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we glory in our suffering. You know the word glory there in the Hebrew, it's the word kavod. It's where we get our word for weight. Thlipsis is a weight. Trials, it's a weight. It's a burden. But God says there's a greater weight. It's the kavod. It's the glory. And you're going to experience me like you never have before. You're going to learn to love me like you never have before. I'm going to reveal myself to you, ego ami, I am that I am, in ways you've never seen me before. And not only so, we also glory in our suffering, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Spirit who has been given to us this beautiful, mesmerizing, symbiotic relationship between faith, hope, and love, that when we go through the trials and the storms, it's growing our faith, it's strengthening our hope, it's deepening our love, and the storm is teaching us things that a mountain never could. Because you'll never know that Jesus is all that you need until Jesus is all that you have. Let's all stand.